Thank you, everyone, for coming in this afternoon. Thank you so much for what I know is going to be an outstanding afternoon, and a very special one for all of us here at the AA. And I want to first thank all of you for coming in this afternoon in the audience, all of our speakers for coming in around the world, and of course Alan himself for agreeing with us to celebrate his life and career in architecture, and for the many great friendships, projects, ideas that have come from that. I think since 1962, Alan's writings have, as everybody I think in this audience knows, been at the absolute forefront of modern architecture's reconciliation with the reality that architecture has a past. And I think the remarkable thing 50 years later from first essays is to realize how vital and central that very reality is to architecture today. For many years, you all know, Alan has written on, let's say, the correspondence, whether imagined, real, fantasized, or genuinely developed, the correspondence between modern architecture and traditions of various kinds. And I think in remarkable ways and with a level of scholarship and critical analysis that no one else in the world today could possibly approach, he's demonstrated the urgency of our continued evaluation of that correspondence. And this afternoon is really an extension of that project. A great group of friends, colleagues, fellow critics are joining Alan today to discuss his work and ideas, and for that reason I'm going to keep these welcome remarks very short and to the point, to just say thank you all very much for coming in. Alan's topic and great interest for many years is genuinely architectural form in all its possibilities. I think the one thing I would say, as someone who came to this school 25 years ago with a copy of his first collection of essays in my bag, it was published in the early 1980s, and for someone like an American that comes from a country without history, it was an eye-opening text. As someone who came over with that book, I think while his interest, you could say, is architectural form, what the writings demonstrate absolutely, and this would be my small contribution to a much more learned discussion that will take place afterwards, my point would be that I think Alan's absolute mastery lies in the form of the architectural essay itself. The interesting feature of that to me is that if one looks back, you could say that the essay as we know it as a form, the written form of an essay, lies at the very core of what modernity and the modern project brought. Interestingly, the ideas we think of as the Enlightenment and the modern world proliferate in the world from great cities in Europe through the distribution of essays. And one of the uncommented parts, I think, of Alan's work is the role that the essay continues to play in the shaping and I think the changing of architectural minds. And I think that's the great and lasting effect of Alan's lifelong dedication as an architect to a literary form that I think really does invent the modern world itself. And with that, all I can say is, Alan, thank you so much on behalf of the entire AA for us being able to put on this event. Thank you to everyone who's played a part in putting this together. Tom Weaver next door in A Publications has helped hugely. Roberta Jenkins upstairs in my office. Last spring, Alan Leibowitz, a close and dear friend of Alan's, came upstairs with Alan to me so that we could begin planning this event. Thank you all so much for all of the hard work in this and for all of our speakers this afternoon who've come in for what I know is going to be a wonderful afternoon of presentations. I'm going to turn over to Mary McLeod, who has agreed to moderate and organize the day. Alan, thank you.
Just for a second, because he'll squirm if it's up there too long. Oh, what happened to it? How does it go back on for a second? There it is. Okay. That's Alan speaking a couple of years ago, a very blurry image, I'm afraid, at the Berlage. And you can in fact hear him. He may not like me saying this directly. There's a video that you can find on the website. But let's take that off. How do I do that? It is a genuine pleasure and honor to introduce Alan. In a way, obviously, this introduction is not necessary for many of you in this room, and to participate with these wonderful friends and colleagues of Alan's to discuss his writings and contribution to architecture this afternoon at the AA, which is in fact his own alma mater, on the occasion of his 90th year. I would like to thank Brett Steele for organizing, sponsoring this event, and also Tom Weaver and Roberta Jenkins, and for inviting me to participate. For those of us who went to architecture school in the early 1970s, at least a certain nexus of East Coast schools in the US, it seemed there were two critics of architecture, at least two who counted, and they were both British. Colin Rowe and Alan Colquhoun, and I must admit there are two other Brits in the room who might compete for that title, but they came on my horizon a bit later. Colin Rowe taught us to see and to appreciate how sophisticated the compositional strategies of modern architecture could be. He also enabled us to understand the neo-Corbusian games of our teachers, and later urban contextualism and collage. But Alan Colquhoun, Rowe's contemporary and even roommate briefly in 1947, for those of you who didn't know it, I keep fantasizing about the conversations they must have had, played another role for my generation and those following. He taught us to think harder about architecture and to question our own assumptions, and he suggested new avenues to explore. In short, he was the person we talked to and liked to debate ideas with. This was, in fact, the reason that a group of us, then younger architects, invited him in the early 1980s to join us in a small study group, later called Revisions. We were reacting in part against both the formalism of the New York Five and the apolitical climate of historicist postmodernism. Like Rowe, Alan recognized the classical strain in modern architecture and its continuities with tradition that Brett just alluded to. And like Rowe, he was acutely conscious, aware of Le Corbusier's formal subtleties and compositional techniques. But unlike Rowe, his interest was always broached in terms of meaning and ideology, themes that would become so critical in both postmodernism and our own examination or re-examination of the Frankfurt School in relationship to architecture. Before we met him, of course, he had already helped shape our ideas. It was through Alan's seminal essay of Typology and the Design Method, published in Arena in 1967, and I first read it in a version that came out shortly thereafter in Perspecta, that most of us first discovered typology in the US. But not as some formulaic design method a la Rob Creer or some of Rossi's American followers, but rather as a means to explore critically issues of meaning and convention, and to address that inevitable gap in design, which he so brilliantly delineated between the modern movement's espousal of what he called biotechnical determinism, that was always a mouthful for me, of meaning functionalism and structural rationalism, and its less consciously articulated reliance on creative intuition. And if that essay challenged some of the lingering myths of modern architecture, while it provided a constructive approach to thinking about design, another essay served to challenge that facile rhetoric of meaning that had already begun to surface in North American architecture schools in the early 1970s. Historicism and the Limits of Semiology of 1972, and I might stress that date. the limits of semiology. We had just read Mario Gondozonis' essay that was on progressive architecture with a drawing of Michael Graves contrasting the semantic and the syntactic dimensions of supposedly Graves and Eisenman, and already had come out this critique. Here, Colquhoun carefully analyzed the similarities and differences between architecture and linguistic systems, raising issues about forced analogies between architecture and language, while reminding us of architecture's own particular nature as an artistic medium, always related to a specific historical condition. He insisted that a purely synchronic approach could never explain a medium so intrinsically tied to a social, economic, and political context, and in which decisions about form and style were highly intentional, and in which matter, physical matter, the materiality of architecture, was part of its meaning. At times, his rigorously dialectical, though non-teleological method would result in conclusions which seemed elliptical or even equivocal. But it was this very quality of ambiguity, or rather, I should say, it was the absolute lucidity and precision by which he characterized architecture's own ambiguities, its complexities and contradictions, that made him so stimulating both to his peers and to a younger generation. In his book, The New Brutalism, Reyner Banham described him as, quote, one of the guardians of intellectual conscience of his generation of London architects. The same could be said for two more generations in the United States. And I might mention, besides his just penetrating intelligence, his intellectual honesty, and his dispassionate criticism. I was always, as an American, where criticism often got highly personal and caused huge feuds, it always amazed me after Reyner Banham could help dedicate his book to Alan, saying that it was in fact a quote of Alan's, which I'll read. What distinguishes modern architecture is surely a new sense of space and the machine aesthetic as the basis, the lodestone, he said, of his own study, that Alan could then write a dispassionate but not uncritical review of Reyner Banham's book shortly thereafter. And I also remember Jim Sterling, or at least I was told after reading his review, the review that Alan wrote of Stuttgart, asking Alan afterwards, did you really like the building, Alan? It was that kind of ability to talk about his peers in a measured, insightful way, never personal, but always perceptive, that just struck us as a model of criticism. But before listening to the talks this afternoon about his writing and critical work, a few other biographical facts are relevant. First and foremost, Alan is an architect. In 1939, he began his training at the Edinburgh College of Art, and then after serving in the Army during World War II, and I hope at some point Bob Maxwell will give us a few tales, he completed his studies at the Architectural Association in London. After receiving his degree in 1949, he worked in the progressive social milieu of the Housing Department of the London County Council Architects Office from September 1949 to April 1955. And there he was part of a team with Sandy Wilson and Peter Carter. Apparently he asked, after a year of working on schools, if he could be part of the housing team, where he worked on a variation of Le Corbusier's Maisonnette. And the project, I gather, has just recently been redone, that he worked on one of them on Bentham Road. After that came a brief stint in Candelas, Josek and Wood's office in Paris, where he again worked on housing. I think he worked on several of the Millionaire housing projects. After that, he returned to London, where he worked about 5 years, from 1956 to 61, for a firm that was quite fashionable among young, committed, intellectual modernists, Lyons, Israel, and Ellis, which was known for its early brutalist buildings. And I saw one of his last projects just recently, an image Alan showed me at Bridgenorth, a girls' school, which is a kind of amazing synthesis of some Corbusian ideas and Team 10 ideas, which I hope I can see sometime soon. Here he encountered at various moments Neve Brown and his future partner John Miller, and I gather he took the place or came right after James Sterling and Jim Gowan. In 1960, when he was actually offered a partnership in the firm, he told the partners he would like to leave, and they very generously gave a commission for a high school in London, and it was at this point that Alan asked John Miller to join him in practice. This was the beginning of a productive partnership and practice which lasted for over 25 years, which included a series of institutional buildings, schools, community centers, daycare centers, as well as housing, both larger complexes and sensitive infill projects, followed in the 1980s with public buildings such as museums. And since Alan suggested I limit myself to only 2 projects, and I should have ignored him, I rather arbitrarily picked out 2 early ones. The Forest Gate High School. How do I get back on? Can you? Okay. The firm's first project, 1961 to 65, which Kenneth Frampton perceptively characterized as indebted to brutalism, but with discrete detailing replacing the didactic abrasiveness, meaning exposed plumbing, of some other of his contemporaries' work. This might be said about all of Colquhoun and Miller's architecture, which accommodates function with rigor and ease, even elegance, while retaining a sensitivity to scale and context. Formal and functional hierarchies are closely conjoined, and a second building, I'll show another early building, is the chemistry building at Royal Holloway College in Surrey. But I suspect many of you know much better than I other works by the firm housing like Fenny Stratford, 79, the Old Brook 2 housing at Milton Keynes, or a project which Alan began with, but I gather John Miller worked on the final design and supervised construction, the Whitechapel Gallery, Art Gallery extension. So if he was an architect, Alan was a teacher. Beginning in 1957, he taught at the AA in London, directing theses projects. In the early 70s, members of the so-called Grunt Group, maybe some of them are here, Ed Jones, Jeremy Dixon, Michael Gold were among his students. But there were other venues. Princeton University in 1966, where he met Thomas Maldonado, and I think it was an exchange with Maldonado that generated the type article that was so fundamental to many of our educations. Cornell University in 1968 to 70, University College Dublin, and then at the Polytechnic of Central London, now called Westminster, where he taught from 74 to 78. In 1980, he accepted a full-time tenured position at Princeton University, where he taught studio, architectural history, and theory until 2002. Here, a whole generation of architects, theorists, and historians were challenged, stimulated, and encouraged by Alan, including myself. Even though I had long finished my coursework, he was one of my dissertation readers, and one couldn't have asked for a sharper, more insightful, and generous reader. He also taught me much about writing, as he scrupulously copy-edited my drafts, getting rid of my many awful Americanisms, including my tendency to use nouns as adjectives, which is forever ingrained in my head. And third, as is evident to all of us here today, he is a writer, a critic, a theorist, and a historian. The first published piece I know appeared in Architectural Review in July 1954, a letter criticizing Pevsner's association of modern architecture with the picturesque. It's a very sharp letter. It's republished in Joan Ochman's anthology, Architecture Culture, and for those of you who haven't read it, I would encourage looking at it. There are now 3 volumes of essays, as well as his important survey of modern architecture. The first, an oppositions book, I actually have Since you all probably know the Black Dog book, I'm going to show you the first one was this one with an introduction by Kenneth Frampton. The second, a collection in 1989, is called Modernity and the Classical Tradition, Architectural Essays 1980 to 87, published by MIT Press. And the third, which I think most of you know well by this point, was published by the relatively new press, Black Dog, in 2008. And it's a kind of oeuvre complete of his critical writings, including the material from the first 2 volumes, as well as essays from 1989 onward. And also the 2 essays on regionalism, which I suspect Ken Frampton will come back to very shortly. Finally, of course, I should mention his historical survey, Modern Architecture, published by Oxford in 2002, and now in French and Spanish editions. Is that correct? Good. Where his long-standing interest in the tensions between modernity and history are beautifully and concisely explored. It unites close readings of buildings with theoretical discussion, and like so much of his writing, is a model, repeating myself, of concision, clarity, and sharp analytic thought. Please join me in welcoming Alan Colquhoun and wishing him a belated 90th birthday. I want to introduce the first 2 speakers in the morning to give you a little idea of the format. We'll be following the order that was on the original poster and the original image. Kenneth Frampton will start, followed by Bob Maxwell, and then we will have a coffee break, some questions from the audience about the first 2 talks, depending on things, and then a coffee break, and after that, 3 talks in the afternoon, which I'll introduce those speakers later. Kenneth Frampton, my colleague at Columbia, was also a graduate at the AA, receiving his diploma some 7 years after Alan in 1956. And like Alan, and this is something that struck me so much about an older generation of practitioners, he moved gracefully from being a practicing architect to being a teacher and writer, with the additional role of journal editor, and we'll have other journal editors this afternoon. He began practicing. I remember seeing, and I can't remember who lived there, the Golden Lane housing project where he designed this stair tower. After that, he practiced in Israel, and then collaborated with Douglas Stevens for a bit in the 60s. In the US, one of his projects that we all know is his Marcus Garvey Park Village housing in the Bronx of 1973. More recently, he worked on his own little house in Narrowsburg, Pennsylvania. As editor, this was actually before my period in architecture. He was technical editor of AD, where he was also responsible for much of the typographical design, including 36 covers. In those days, I think you did everything when you edited magazines, quite different from current practice. Teaching. Royal College of Art as a visiting tutor in the 60s, 61 to 64. At Princeton University, and I just missed him, 67 to 72, and has been at Columbia ever since, where he was chair in the mid-80s and director of the PhD program and beginner of the PhD program from 1993 to 2006, with endless visiting teaching stints, Lausanne, Rice, Naples, ETH, and Mendrisio, where he was commuting back and forth with New York. I can't possibly mention all the publications. There's some 18 books, if I counted correctly, but I'd like to single out his book on modern architecture and the Critical Present, 1983, in its 4th edition, 2007. Studies in Tectonic Culture, 1995. His book on Le Corbusier, a French version, in 1997. English, 2002. And then his collection of essays, 2002, Labor, Work, and Architecture. And of course, I can't introduce Ken without mentioning his provocative essay on critical regionalism that was published in '83, and I think may have sparked some of Alan's own thinking on this in the '90s. He also wrote the introduction to Alan's oppositions book and to the last volume of Alan's writings. I'll turn right away to Bob Maxwell, so I don't have to interrupt between their talks. Bob is probably known, I know he's known Alan any longer than any of the other participants in the conference, maybe longer than anyone in this room. They were in India together, and I was just informed Alan was his boss. The roles got switched later. This was during World War II. Bob Maxwell was educated at the Liverpool School of Architecture, where he was a contemporary of Colin Rowe and James Stirling. After he qualified, he worked as an architect and became a partner at Douglas Stephen and Partners, who seems to be this mythic figure that I keep hearing about. There are some 6 buildings in London, as Bob told me, that he can point to as his work, including a house. I assume that was a typo. It's Kensington, not Kennington?
Kennington.
Kennington. Okay, it's a place I don't know. Sorry. Flats in Highgate, and the Rivers facade, if you haven't noticed it, at Royal Festival Hall. We can give Bob credit for that. From 1958, he's taught architecture, first at the AA, where he was a first-year master, then at the Bartlett at University College London, where he was in turn senior lecturer, reader, and then professor. And in 1982, this is when the roles got flipped, he was appointed Dean of Architecture at Princeton University, where he's now emeritus. And I still remember how delighted Alan was when he became Dean. And I was delighted, we were all delighted to have Bob there. He returned to Britain in 1993 and has continued to write on architecture and its relation to the arts. His books include New British Architecture, 72, The Venturi Effect, 78, Sweet Disorder and the Carefully Careless, a title that somehow reminds me of Bob, 1993, and Two-Way Stretch of 1996, and of course written for many magazines, including Architectural Design, Architectural Review, and Casabella. And very recently, he delivered the Paul Rudolph Lecture at Yale University. And one thing that's not on his CV, he's also a very good jazz pianist, and I hope we get to hear a little later on. Thank you for both participating, Ken and Bob, and I'll turn it over to Kenneth Frampton right now.
Yeah, right. Well, I think there's going to be a certain amount of repetition in any case. I'm sort of happy to have the delusion that I'm not quite as jet lagged as Mary McLeod, in that I don't think it's the morning right now. But I want to thank Brett Steele above all, and Tom Weaver, and Mary McLeod and other colleagues. I'm particularly grateful to have been invited to be present at this event. I'm very honored to celebrate Alan's venerable achievements, and so much so that I have to say that what I'm going to say will be read, because I can't trust myself to ad lib this presentation. It's an honor and a privilege to have been invited to participate in this tribute to the distinguished architect critic Alan Colquhoun on the occasion of his 90th birthday. Although it is somewhat intimidating to do so in his presence and before an audience comprised in part of his contemporaries, in part of figures like myself who would like to think they have followed his lead, in part a subsequent generation of pedagogues represented by Mary McLeod, perhaps by Jacques Gubler, Stanislaus von Moos, who are here, and Françoise Fromonot, and finally an audience most of whom would have probably only had the pleasure of reading him rather than actually receiving instruction firsthand, so to speak. Born in 1931, Alan Colquhoun belongs to that generation who served in the Second World War along with those such as Robert Maxwell, who first met him in the British Army in India, and Colin Rowe, who, invalided out of the services before the end of the war, initiated a new genre of criticism with his essay, The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, published in 1947. This was well before Alan's own debut, so to speak, as a critic of consequence with his seminal review of Rayner Banham's magnum opus of 1962, The Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, a review which first appeared in the British Journal of Aesthetics in that year. And actually, of course, the book is 1960 and the review is 1962. In the preface to the first edition of his essays in 1981 by Opposition Books, under the subtitle Modern Architecture and Historical Change, Colquhoun wrote the following, I quote, "Ideas are not the property of individuals," and then proceeded to acknowledge that, I quote, "there is a small group of architects and architectural thinkers to whom I owe a special debt of gratitude. My thanks are due first to John Miller, to discussions with whom, and in the context of project work, many of the problems dealt with in these essays first became apparent. Secondly, to Robert Maxwell, Colin Rowe, and Thomas Stevens, whose companionship and conversation have provided over the years a constant inspiration and example, even if my views and theirs do not always coincide. And thirdly, to Thomas Lorenz, whose textual criticism has made a significant contribution to several recent essays. I think probably he has in mind historicism and the limits of semiology, or at least one of them. With the exception of the then exiled Catalan philosopher Lorenz, whom I also had the privilege to meet because of Alan, all these figures essentially belong to the same circle, which significantly enough, with the occasional exception of Maxwell, kept a certain distance, we could say, from the ICA independent group, not only from the Smithsons and Banham, but also from their acknowledged affinity for the Dymaxion world of Buckminster Fuller. And here, when I was asked just before starting this, do I have illustrations? I said, yes, they are mostly decorative. And, and this is one of those. Fuller, with which Archigram, Cedric Price, and John McHale were equally enamored to varying degrees. Something similar, of course, also obtained with Norman Foster, who, in his early career, I believe, was in the habit of taking Fuller by plane to see his latest work whenever the latter showed up in London, presumably to receive some kind of benediction. If on one side of this divide, Buckminster Fuller was in some measure the architectural guru of the independent group, on the other, the center of the skeptically modern humanist circle to which Colquhoun belonged was by chance rather than by design the eccentric, ironic polymath Sam Stevens, who had been the initial teacher of Rowe in Liverpool, I believe, and hence by descent, so to speak, also of Maxwell, and who was one of Rowe's first students. It was Maxwell, that is. It was Stevens who first introduced this circle to Alberto Sartoris's comprehensive survey, Encyclopédie de l'architecture moderne, Ordre et Climat Méditerranée. And it was this survey of the pre-war international modern movement, particularly in Europe, which prompted Stevens to become an early aficionado of Italian rationalism, and above all, the metaphysical modernized classicism of Giuseppe Turani. The presence of this agent provocateur makes it difficult to enter into an appraisal of Colquhoun without making a posthumous homage to Thomas Stevens himself, who had, I believe, worked at one time alongside Colquhoun in the LCC Architects Department and who later taught history in the AA with great aplomb, and exerted an influence not only on Rowe and Maxwell, but also on Colquhoun and on myself. I mentioned the aplomb because Sam was in the habit at the last minute rushing into the slide library, collecting all sorts of random slides together and giving a talk. I mean, he could get away with that. But anyway, further to this, both Stevens and Colquhoun would exercise an influence upon me by recommending two quite different, for me, seminal texts. The first being Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, which Stevens urged me to read in 1965, just prior to my first visit to the States, and was a total revelation and a key to the States in certain ways. The second being Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, which Colquhoun gave to me in November 1966, during the period when he was first a visiting professor in Princeton. I still have this battered copy, which is so marked up I can't possibly show it, not even as a decorative illustration. Arendt's double distinction of work versus labor, public versus private, were to be particularly revealing for me, inasmuch as these categories could also be seen as paralleling the time-honored distinction we commonly make between architecture and building. However, even more meaningful in the long run was her equally seminal socio-cultural concept of the space of public appearance, to which I will briefly return. Marcuse's brilliant attempt to synthesize the analytical paradigms of Freud and Marx introduced first Alan and then myself to the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, I believe. I have a hunch that Colquhoun may have first become aware of Eros and Civilization through the Marxist design theorist Thomas Maldonado, who was also, as you've already heard, a visiting tutor at Princeton during the time that Alan was first there. Although neither Arendt nor Marcuse will feature prominently in the development of Colquhoun's discourse, we have little reason to doubt that the intellectual trajectory of the Frankfurt School, both before and after the Second World War, did play some role in the evolution of his thought, furthered perhaps by Jürgen Habermas's Adorno Prize address of '68, Technology and Science as Ideology, which was close to Colquhoun's own critique of that which Maldonado would eventually come to recognize as techno-idolatry. This much is already suggested as a line of reasoning in two successive early essays by Colquhoun. First, his incisive review of Banham's seminal Theory and Design, in which Banham, while celebrating futurism at length, would pointedly omit any reference to Italian rationalism. And second, Colquhoun's subsequent critique of the scientific design methodology, then being rigorously pursued in the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, a modus operandi which Colquhoun seems to have first become aware of through attending Maldonado's Princeton seminars in the late 60s. With regard to this last, I have in mind Colquhoun's essay, which Mary has already mentioned, Typology and Design Method, as this first appeared in the AA magazine Arena in June 1967. Both of these essays criticized in diverse ways the then cherished illusion that architectural design could be reduced to some form of applied science wherein the resulting synthesis would acquire its self-evident significance by virtue of being a transparent manifestation of the process which had engendered it. Although this for Banham was exemplified by Fuller's skeletal geodesic dome, Colquhoun proceeded to show how Banham's technocratic idealization of Fuller was totally at variance with his more subtle appreciation of the masterworks of the pre-war modern movement. To this end, Colquhoun wrote, quote, "But in spite of the weight he gives to the opinions of Fuller, in the last chapter of the book, Dr. Banham's final view of the modern movement remains ambivalent. If Fuller were right, the whole oeuvre of the European architects of the 1920s would be invalid, since its impact clearly lies in formal patterns which are not solely dictated by techniques. If it is true, on the other hand, that these architects were concerned not with the literal but with the symbolic interpretation, then Fuller's criticisms fall to the ground, and the meaning attributed to the role of the machine in architecture is more important than the degree to which the structures reflect the course of machine technology as such, end quote. Colquhoun will return to this theme in an essay entitled The Symbolic and Literal Aspects of Technology, first published in Architectural Design in November '62, during my time as co-editor of the magazine. Colquhoun will develop this further in an essay, Typology and Design Method, which we've already mentioned, which revealed Maldonado's ambivalence, since while advocating rigorously design methodology, Maldonado continued to advocate, or recognize at least, the heuristic value of type in the generation of form. As Colquhoun put it at the time, quote, Maldonado is suggesting something quite new and something which has been rejected again and again by modern theorists. He is suggesting that the area of pure intuition must be based on a knowledge of past solutions applied to related problems, and that creation is a process of adapting forms derived either from the past needs or from past aesthetic ideologies to the needs of the present. Although he regards this as a provisional solution, a cancer in the body of the solution, he nonetheless recognizes that this is the actual procedure which designers follow, end quote. Although Colquhoun acknowledged that this typological approach was an anathema to the left-wing Neue Sachlichkeit architects of the pre-war modern movement, he also argued that what we now understand by type and the role it might play in the future generation of form seems to remain as valid as ever. As he put it, quote, the characteristic of our age is changed, and it is precisely because this is so that it is necessary to investigate the part which type solutions play in relation to problems and solutions which are without precedent in any received tradition, end quote. Colquhoun's affirmation of the type as a modern parti pris will effectively color much of his subsequent criticism, particularly in those essays where he reveals the exchange between tradition and innovation in Le Corbusier and the simultaneous play between organic convenience of the free plan and the unifying role of the classical prism. Aside from Banham, with whom he will conduct an implicit debate throughout the late 60s and 70s, at once appreciative of Banham's erudition and perception, while remaining skeptical of his tendency towards technocratic populism, Colquhoun was surely influenced by two distinctly different lines inherited from British architectural criticism of the previous decade. In the first instance, Rowe's Neo-Palladian rereading of the Villa Gauche, as we find this in the Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, which offered a totally new appraisal of Le Corbusier from the standpoint of Rudolf Wittkower's Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism of 1949, and in the second by John Summerson's A Case for a Theory of Modern Architecture, delivered as a lecture to the RIBA in 1953. What Colquhoun drew from Rowe, could be Rome, was the mandate to reinterpret the work of Le Corbusier in the light of vernacular versus classical form, delving into the past to reinterpret the present, and vice versa. Whereas from Summerson's skeptical reassessment of modern architecture, he was, to my mind, influenced by the argument Summerson advanced at the end of his lecture that either the functional program or the formal paradigm had to be the source of unity, and that, ipso facto, one could not have two sources of unity. However, Colquhoun's subsequent analysis of Le Corbusier obliged him to take issue with this rather reductive formulation. This much is evident from his earliest seminal essays on Le Corbusier, his Formal and Functional Interactions, a study of two late buildings by Le Corbusier, of which this is one, and his displacements of concepts in Le Corbusier, both essays being published in AD in 1966 and 72, respectively. In both of these essays, Colquhoun demonstrated how the disjunction between function and form would come to be resolved throughout the work of Le Corbusier, from the purest free plan of his early maturity in the late 20s to the monumental bricolage of his Indian work of the 50s and his recourse to mat building in the Venice hospital at the end of his life. In all of this, Colquhoun's perception was greatly enhanced, I believe, by his experience as an architect, as a principal in the practice of Colquhoun and Miller, as you already know, an experience that was soon to be followed, and particularly after 1980, by his teaching at Princeton on a regular basis. Colquhoun's essays on Le Corbusier are at once both extraordinarily perceptive and at times surprisingly insular, I think. This is suggested by the comparison that he makes between the French embassy design for Brasilia, shown here, and the top-lit, pinwheeling, gridded form of Le Corbusier's 1964 proposal for Venice. Well, actually, this is a bit in advance. This is not Venice, which, designed with Julian de la Fuente, was to be the last project of his life. I am struck even now, when going back through this comparison by Colquhoun, of Colquhoun's perspicacity in recognizing the epistemic importance of Le Corbusier's transformation of the bricolage of the 1930s into the blade walls of his Indian buildings, as is evidenced by the Villa Chaudin and the Chancellery in Brasilia, which I've just shown you. This was, in fact, and I think it is only Colquhoun, I think, that has ever really underlined this. This was, in fact, a new device for the manipulation of space, comparable to the role played by the pilotis in the 5 points of a new architecture of 1926. At the same time, although Colquhoun acknowledged the influential precedent of the Free University of Berlin by Candelis, Josek, and Woods, dating from 1963, he nonetheless ignores, perhaps at this juncture, the seminal contribution made by the Dutch structuralists to the Le Corbusier paradigm. In particular, of course, these debates that took place, Team 10 debates at Royaumont in 1962, when figures like Piet Blom and Alder van Eyck and George Candelis would in fact advance this pinwheel layered mat building as a paradigm, and I think this had an enormous influence on the Venice Hospital. It's shown here, of course, in the plan of the Venice Hospital, but this is Candelis, Fort Lamy, 64-65, and this is Piet Blom, a kind of conceptual diagram that was exhibited in Royaumont in 62. Six years later, in his essay on the development of concepts in Le Corbusier, Colquhoun moves backwards and forwards in time across the trajectory of Le Corbusier's career in order to reveal that what we had previously taken as a direct consequence of a purely functionalist approach to architecture, in accordance with the machine rhetoric implicit in Le Corbusier's 5 points, was in fact in many instances a subtle displacement of classical tropes, as we find these, say, in the displacement of the classical peristyle in front of a typical Palladian villa into the pilotis that are to be found beneath Le Corbusier's purest prisms of the 1920s. Comparable displacements are cited by Colquhoun. In the first instance, Le Corbusier's pointed use of the traditional adicular window, shown here, of course, in the center on top, in contrast to the curtain wall and the fenêtre en longueur, also, of course, here. And in the second, Le Corbusier's well-known transpositions of the ocean-going liner into projects as diverse as the Immeuble Villa, the factory at Saint-Dié, the Unité d'Habitation Marseille, and last but not least, the monastery in La Tourette. I don't have any of these images, but I do have another of the Villa Gauche, and the contrast, of course, between the front and the back in the Villa Gauche, and between the articular window and the long window. In contrast to modes of formal analysis inherited from Rowe, Colquhoun will veer towards an overview which, in retrospect, I feel one can only recognize as neo-Marxist. And it is this, more than anything else, that will serve to divide him not only from the disenchanted romantic humanism of Rowe, but also from the volatile brutalism of the Smithsons and the techno-idolatry of Banham, let alone the distance he will also ultimately take from the socio-anthropological approach advanced by the Dutch structuralists. Colquhoun's neo-Marxism is never more evident than his critique of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, published on the occasion of the building coming to completion in 1977. After contrasting British and French traditional attitudes towards culture, this is a typical subtle and sharp Colquhoun aside, the one derivative and apologetic, meaning the British attitude towards culture, and the other abstract and institutional, meaning the French, he will go on to expose the contradictions inherent in what was then the new neoliberal cultural policy of the French state, to the effect that, I quote, "What is new in," I find this just an amazing passage. "What is new in the Gaullist position is the respect usual among conservatives for the traditional values of the organic society has been replaced by an enthusiasm for the, quote, modern and the avant-garde. This enthusiasm compounds the contradictions inherent in their attitude, since avant-gardism itself suffered from similar contradictions. On the one hand, it wished to abolish academic, brackets, elitist culture in the name of free creation, quotes, the artistic equivalent of liberalism, brackets. On the other, it proposed a severe functionalism and a pure formalism which were unacceptable to the average man, in quotes, because they excluded all those conventions and habits of feeling to which he is attached, and this is even more cutting, and to which the commercialism of the liberal state attaches him more and more firmly, end quote. As Colquhoun points out, when turning to building itself, we are asked both by the jury and the architects to recognize this ultra-functionalist high-tech work as a popular, down-to-earth, up-to-the-minute solution that totally eliminates any vestige of gratuitous symbolic gestures. I might point out that, of course, it's Centre Pompidou above and Norman in collaboration with Foster at the bottom, the climate office. Elsewhere, towards the end of his critique, after denying that the Centre Pompidou has anything to do with either the heroic ferrovitreous engineering works of the 19th century, Eiffel Tower, etc., or with the ideologically revolutionary works of the Russian constructivists, Colquhoun argues that in the last analysis it has much more to do with the science fiction visions of Archigram, let alone Cedric Price's more radically socialist Fun Palace proposal, which surprisingly enough Colquhoun does not mention, but which probably was a more direct influence on the Centre Pompidou. In the end, Colquhoun's basic critique of the work takes place on two fronts. On the one hand, he sees it as being technologically over-determined. It assumes, to quote him, that, quote, the architecture has no further task other than to perfect its own technology, end quote, while on the other hand, he sees it as being over-determined by the modern cult of flexibility. As he puts it, vis-a-vis flexibility, flexibility seems to have led to an over-schematic solution which does not take into account the size of the building. I find this so perceptive. He goes on, it is difficult to envisage any function which would require an unimpeded 50-meter span with height limitations of 7 meters, 3 meters of which is taken up by lattice beams. I mean, you know, it's tough. At the end of his review, he concludes that most faults derive, quote, from two fundamental decisions: that the building should be conceived as a well-serviced shed, that its symbolism should be concerned with its mechanical support systems. The first has resulted in too schematic an interpretation of the brief, leaving the architect without any means of control over a host of unforeseen practical existences. and has relegated to other authorities formal decisions which properly belong to the architect. The second has resulted in a building which idealizes process to the exclusion of any idea towards what this process, quotation marks, should be aimed. Both decisions presuppose that culture, in quotes, is an absolute which cannot be mediated by any final form, and that its achievement must be indefinitely postponed. If this were all true, all language, not only that of architecture, would be impossible. It's a very Colquhoun ending. This last line hints at the goal towards which Colquhoun would always be striving, namely to reformulate the avant-gardist legacy of the modern movement in such a way as to enable it to reconstitute the failed modern project as a systematic symbolic lingua franca comparable to that of neoclassical humanism, the civic significance of which would be spontaneously accessible to the society at large. This ambitious tall order explains why he would be so preoccupied with analyzing the hybridized endgame of Le Corbusier's humanism, passing from an idealized white architecture to a conscious effort after 1931 to integrate the vernacular syntax of the Mediterranean into his work. At the same time, Colquhoun will be equally preoccupied with two primary modern alternatives, so to speak. First, with the Anglo-Italian high-tech work, Rogers' piano, Foster, etc., and second, with Dutch structuralism, particularly in the two, as these two paradigms made themselves manifest in the Centre Pompidou and in Hermann Hertzberger's Central Beheer insurance offices completed in Apeldoorn in 1974. It is significant that in terms of its castellated but ultimately mute, non-hierarchic, blank exterior, this last, like Norman Foster's comparable high-tech Willis Faber Dumas building of the same date, should be derived from Frank Lloyd Wright's, it's Norman Foster's Willis Faber Dumas, of course, is above, should be derived from Frank Lloyd Wright's surrogate city in miniature, his introspective compensatory microcosmic Larkin building of 1904. For Colquhoun, the primary shortfall of these rival late modern formulations, i.e. high-tech versus structuralism, was the fact that both within and without, they were both equally incapable of embodying any kind of civic unity with which to reinstate in physical terms Hannah Arendt's space of public appearance, although Colquhoun will never have recourse to this term. In the space of a brief gloss, it is not possible to deal with such a prodigious body of work spanning some 43 years between his opening critique of '62 and his lecture on changing museums published for Stanislaus von Moos's Festschrift of 2005. Colquhoun's various essays of the mid-90s reacted rather vehemently to the re-emergence of regionalism as on the contemporary scene, as this was first formulated by Alex Zonis and Liane Lefebvre in their 1981 essay, The Grid and the Pathway, which appeared in that year in Architecture in Greece, and which was followed by my essay Towards the Critical Regionalism, which appeared in Hal Foster's The Anti-Aesthetic of 1983. Both arguments being categorically rejected by Colquhoun as soft leftism. And now, after 30 years of globalization, one even has less ground on which to repudiate Colquhoun's rejection of critical regionalism as a hopelessly romantic cause, particularly given the current worldwide undermining of the Enlightenment ideal of the democratic nation state. This is more than a crisis of culture, I believe, for instead it is perhaps the beginning of the disintegration of technocratic corporate capitalism, the seemingly triumphant technocratic corporate capitalism. This force has already led to a disturbing aporia which permeate our daily lives, from the manifest evidence of climate change to the wholesale pollution of the sea, from the predication of our techno-scientific economy on the constantly increasing use of fossil fuels to the continued maximization of profligate consumption worldwide, shopping, in other words. Towards the unfinished modern project in the liberative Habermasian sense of the term, I mean, surely the unfinished modern project in the liberative Habermasian sense of the term has never been more threatened than it is now, and in retrospect it is unsettling to find Colquhoun keeping his distance, so to speak, from the revisionist, anti-avant-garde later development of the modern movement, which had already arrived on the world stage, as I've already said, by the early 30s, with Le Corbusier's Erasura's House of 1931. To be followed by Alvar Aalto's own house in Munkkiniemi, Helsinki of 1934. In this last regard, I would like to turn to Colquhoun's only essay to deal with the work of Aalto directly. The piece that he wrote for L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in 1976, I believe, on the occasion of the Finnish architect's death. I quote, do I have something here? Yes, I do. For Aalto to have sustained, for Aalto to have submitted to external norms, to the idea of type advocated by Muthesius and Le Corbusier, for instance, would have meant an artificial restraint on the spontaneous invention and denial of architecture as the expression of the richness and complexity of life. But it is here in the idea of architecture as expression that we may find the clue to weakness in certain projects of Aalto, to some of which I have alluded. It is doubtful if the undulating walls of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology or the billowing masses of Imatra actually express anything, for the simple reason that the functions they represent do not correspond to any expectations which users or observers of the buildings would likely to have. They therefore become pure forms, meaningful perhaps in terms of a nominalism which would consider all functions as of equal importance, but meaningless in terms of the architectural program and its cultural context, end quote. In retrospect, this seems to me to be a precipitous, a touch puritanical, even somewhat blind dismissal of Aalto's impressively synthetic achievement on the eve of the Second World War in the case of the Baker Dome. I'm alluding, of course, to the way in which the undulating form of Baker Dome may surely be perceived as a sympathetic topographic response to the expansive landscape of the Charles River, which Colquhoun admittedly acknowledges. However, it also places an emphasis on the refectory at its center as a significant micro-public space cradled within the heart of the building, the proto-civic importance of which Colquhoun seems reluctant to admit. Along with the contextual readability of the whole, I'm alluding with this last to its locally sympathetic rhythmic use of well-crafted brickwork and pierced windows. It is a manifestly durable, non-commodifiable, unostentatious work, in my view, of which I would claim that as at its inception and still now, is legible and reassuring to the average citizen as he or she might wander along the promenade of the river. This issue of semantic legibility is at stake in Colquhoun's equally surprising draconian insistence. Well, he also talks about this building as a ruin, that the Imatra church is meaningless, particularly when one considers the presence of the vaulted forms over the vestigial nave and when these are perceived against the vertical form of the campanile. By countering Colquhoun's critique of Aalto, I am, of course, implying a belated and somewhat stubborn defense of the critically regionalist hypothesis as still a viable stratagem for resisting the present tendency towards a spectacular commodification of the environment beyond any redress. In this regard, I still find Aalto the one magus of the modern movement whose legacy remains capable of further development. In this connection, it is somehow paradoxical that the one wing of the British post-war movement to which he was linked in terms of his own practice, namely the Martin St. John Wilson Hodgkinson School of Cambridge, would be exactly that strand of modernism to which he would to which he would still remain critical. I mean, he was a participant, but still was severely critical of its aspirations. And this, of course, is the British Library by M.J. Long and Colin St. John Wilson. It's not possible for me to conclude this brief appraisal, perhaps not brief enough, of Colquhoun's prodigious output as a critic on such a minor key. It is sobering for me at least, if not for Alan, that this happens to be the third time that I have been drawn into giving an introduction to his work. The first was in 1981, as Mary McLeod said, when I wrote the preface to the first collection, Modern Architecture and Historical Change. The second was much more recently when I wrote the introduction to the 2009 complete works, so to speak, published by Black Dog Press. And rereading that this morning, I thought, my God, I thought, I don't normally write like this. I think it has to be the influence of Alan, and which it is. And each time that I have become consciously engaged with the exceptional depth, rigor, and cultural richness of Alan's thought, I find myself totally overwhelmed by the extraordinary cultivation and penetration of his writing. And this now, for the third time of asking, so to speak, has had the effect of convincing me that the very next thing I need to do as an unduly venerable teacher in a school of architecture, long past my sell-by date, is to give a seminar devoted exclusively to the systematic reading with students of the entirety of Alan's work. The fact that these three successive concentrated encounters with Alan's work over a 30-year period have finally had the effect of convincing me that this is the finest and most sophisticated body of architectural criticism that the English language has seen over the past half-century. By Colquhoun's standards, I regret to say the state of affairs is one in which architectural criticism of any caliber simply doesn't exist. Not in English newspapers, anyway, not in the professional magazines either, and by and large, not even in the writings of the English intellectual cognoscenti. I would like to end in this regard with two amazing paragraphs, which come from Alan's essay, Rules, Reason, and History of 1976. They are just amazing, and I think they are an inspiration. This is the first paragraph. They are separated by a few. Artistic style is the struggle to give meaning to reality as it appears, though this meaning necessarily goes beyond the immediate conditions and embraces meanings which have become embedded in the cultural tradition. It is affected by both the present and the past, which exist in a peculiar state of tension. First paragraph. Second, it is only on such a hermeneutic of tradition that architectural discourse and criticism can be based. Criticism is deprived of all value if it attempts to operate either within the closed world of absolute formal values or with the unlimited world of eclectic play. If criticism is to carry on its function of making judgments, it must have at its disposal norms which belong to the architectural tradition, a ground against which to measure and evaluate the contingencies of the present. Thank you.
I'm Bob Maxwell, and Alan Colquhoun is my oldest friend. We met when I went and joined his unit in Roorkee in India in 1946. He was the adjutant. I was a raw first lieutenant, and I saluted him. He's been my oldest friend, and He was best man at both my weddings. And the piece of his which I love most is his article on French railway stations, which deals with their frontality. Their frontality is very peculiar to railway stations because it derives from the engines, the trains. They have frontality. So frontality was one thing that he appreciated and that I also appreciated that we got from Colin Rowe, I think. Colin Rowe always emphasized the frontality of buildings. After Colin Rowe was teaching at Kansas, it was possible at Texas, it was possible for students to say, my building addresses the park. Okay, well, my piece is nothing like as detailed as Kenneth's, and I apologize for that. It deals more a distant view of Alan, and it's entitled "The Logic of History and the Perils of Conflation." I came to read a certain Frenchman, Victor Duruy, only because of his interest in the Roman Empire, long one of my own interests. His History of the Romans was published in English translation in 1868. At a time when the historian's right to render his account of events into his own voice wasn't doubted. His command of the situation is made clear by his ability to generalize by an appeal to the logic of history. I read a quotation from Victor Duruy. I can't speak with a French accent, but you've got to imagine that. This was the era of attempts at reform. Reforms not having succeeded, revolution became inevitable. The ever-recurring story of those governments which shut their eyes to the future. In France, monarchy being the past which men sought to destroy, the Republic very naturally succeeded it. In Rome, the insurrectionary movement being directed against a republican aristocracy, a monarchy, of course, followed. The logic of history demanded this, and that logic, being the outcome of facts, proved correct in the end. That was a quotation from Victor Duruy. Well, by comparing ancient and modern, he's able to offer an explanation to suggest the operation of an inevitable pattern that underlies history, that renders it potentially into objective science. Without some such capability of analysis, the work of the historian risks degenerating into that of the chronicler, the passive spectator of events. The modern historian hoped to rise to a higher level in reading Gibbon, Spengler, Toynbee. Events unfold with an apparent inevitability that confers on them a transcendental meaning, a telos, allowing the reader to anticipate with irony and to sense the tragedy of human life. History becomes a story. However, the logic of history is not so readily apparent that one can point to it with ease. Historians are clearly not able to predict future outcomes, otherwise they'd be greatly in demand by government. And economists are hardly any more successful in predicting the results of change in economic policy. Logical patterns can only arise from formal relationships based on the recognition of identity, while history never repeats itself exactly, but only in a very broad sense. To demonstrate a logical relationship requires therefore the invention of a model, abstracted from the empirical situation and reduced to a defined set of relationships. It has proved very difficult to model the economy, and it must be even more difficult to model the cultural envelope. Indeed, if we see human development as occurring within the framework that we call culture, we can have no strict basis for comparative analysis of events, since we cannot approach that development as an object. Complex as it is, its complexity is compounded by our situation inside of it. The logic of history seems rather to belong to the retrospective view, which aims to deal with a given period in its totality. This does demand a degree of simplification. Whenever a past period is subject to intense scrutiny, the story seems to take on successive layers of particularity that make it difficult to impose a clear pattern. Yet, this is not to say that within the framework of what the participants in that history believed to be the situation, in the attempt to rationalize their actions in advance, the situation was not indeed simplified and reduced to the pattern of a logic. In the face of action, we ask ourselves, what are the alternatives? Indeed, the formulation of alternatives in order to be able to make a meaningful choice is so essential that it imposes its own dialectical reading of events. Then the sense of the logic of history is conflated with our attachment to the desired outcome, and we succumb to another logic, the logic of persuasion. We assert our claim to possess knowledge of the logic of history in advance. Once under the banner of persuasion, we are in the realm of rhetoric. So long as courses of action are contemplated, they tend to be formed according to an exclusive pattern that allows a clear choice. But if conflation allows the overlapping of two logic, it does not offer us a certain method of disentangling them. That's why we may speak of the perils of conflation. Alan Colquhoun has frequently pointed out the dialectical structure of cultural consciousness, providing us with the pleasure of recognizing the inevitability of the dialectical logic. He often presents us with a set of alternatives that were open to human agents within a given moment of historical revolution, alternatives that between them can be taken to define a total field of action. In the very opening statement of his Essays in Architectural Criticism, he says, I quote, "Architectural theory has always been based upon one of two interpretations of history." End of quote. These were, he said, the normative view inherited as part of a tradition of truth, truth revealed, and an evolutionary view that requires each generation to invent a new truth to supplant and supersede the traditional one. Such alternatives, of course, are not a matter of plain choice, since they are structured in advance on a notion of the historical role of the intelligentsia. The job of the intelligentsia is to question received wisdom and thereby to function as an agent of change. This in turn seems to imply the recognition of a cultural framework in a state of constant evolution, a pervasive condition that is not itself isolable as an object of study. If we recognize that we're trying to see a pattern in a dynamic situation, the difference between normative and innovative is one of the regularities that can most readily be applied. This fact allows an analysis based not on the recognition of identities, but on regular relativities. Cultural consciousness is in a constant process of evolution in which different positions arise, including one position that anticipates change and one that resists it. Considered as a science, history is not amenable to the scientific method. It is deprived of the empirical test that does so much for the physical scientist. In place of the empirical test, we have the judgment of history. That logic which introduces words, being the outcome of facts, proves correct in the end. In place of an anticipatory logic, we have a retroactive logic. It may be, however, that this judgment is anticipated in society by the force that I have called cultural momentum, which might be better described as our sense of the future. As new conditions take shape, the old conditions fade and their compulsion weakens. Each new possibility acquires a credibility that becomes ever more convincing, while the credibility of normative values is by definition always on the wane. In the 16th century, Perrault recognized that the orders of architecture originated in convention and piety rather than in supernatural grace. This perception became in itself an exemplar of the process of cultural change, a process of adaptation and assimilation. With Perrault, a new, intuitively realized sense of freedom emerges, while the authority of the orders is weakened. Yet, the orders in this weakened form can recover sufficient authority, now in combination with the lure of the new, to survive a century or two longer, continuing to preside over further discoveries that extend and enrich the classical canon. In a similar way, modern architecture disowned the classical canon, while allowing it to continue in a modified form. Colquhoun has shown that the modern architecture of the interwar years, and especially in its manifestations with the oeuvre of Le Corbusier, owed as much to received tradition as to the innovative conditions of modern technology. Right? In Le Corbusier's method, tradition was continually modified in order to gain credibility through a process that Colquhoun has clarified as one of metaphoric displacement rather than simply one of innovation and discovery. This indeed suggests that two processes are at work simultaneously and that two logics are overlapping. Within a more or less structuralist worldview, in which I assume we are all still embedded, there is a profound sense in which the ideal can never be realized in its own terms, and the empirical cannot have any meaning unless it reflects the ideal to some degree. In every architect of importance within the history of modernism, we can find aspects of the work that are innovative and others that are reactionary. There's a temptation for the critic to side with the innovative as the side of the angels, but this ignores the nature of intellectual work within the field of creative endeavor by maintaining a detachment from the emotional appeal of the new, by aiming at a balance between the attraction of the forces of change and the forces of conservation. Colquhoun avoids becoming polemically attached to solutions of any kind and remains temperamentally addicted to problems. By preserving this distance, he ensures that his analysis has a broad validity that does not weaken with the passing of the current issues. Two aspects of this evidently dialectical process deserve attention. On the one hand, there's little doubt that the binary opposition as a mode of analysis is not restricted to structuralist thought, but has long been a fundamental figure of rhetoric. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. It works in practice by giving identity to the forces surrounding an action and thus making scrutable the inscrutable. It's just that much easier if he who's not for me is against me. It works for the protagonists, and it works later for the historian. Secondly, such an analysis does not preclude a more detailed analysis of the actions and ideas of the protagonists, who will have their own picture of what they're doing, whether progressive or reactionary, and usually believe that what they're doing is right. Within this motivation, there is also room for irony. To be aware of being committed to the lost cause while holding to it is one of the tropes of classical tragedy. More often, the individual trusts an instinct, follows a compulsion. Colquhoun is perceptive in illuminating for us the nature of the provisional choices that are somehow forced on the protagonists, in this case the innovators of modernity. He shows how these choices necessarily become oppositions, clarifying the confusion by polarizing it. The choice of a particular direction then becomes not only a matter of motivation, but of cognition. The innovator discovers the new by grasping it, by giving it a logical structure, and thus giving it a place within culture. In his analytical system, applied by Colquhoun with even-handed generosity and remorseless logic, there remains some areas of mystery. The framing that allows the logical situation to be satisfactorily resolved is a cognitive one, whereas in practice, history lurches forward without regard to the neatness of the categories by which it is observed. Carlyle's narration of the French Revolution, for example, accepts this complexity and substitutes a dramatic framework for the historical one. His presentation stresses the complex dance of personalities, as well as the unfolding of a logic of violence. And by creating a dramatic narrative, he leaves space for the sense of a tragic outcome. Tolstoy, in War and Peace, contrasts the unexpected turns of the individual drama with the remorseless tide of history, noting that the individuals feel free even when they are bowing to the inevitable. As Thomas Kuhn suggested in trying to elucidate the way in which innovation evades the grip of retrospective logic, this shift to a new paradigm does not operate according to a clear logic, but rather corresponds to a shift in what is seen as interesting. Old hypotheses fade away rather than being vigorously refuted. In explanation of this, the idea of an irretrievable loss of credibility does not seem far-fetched. Credibility is a social value, and it depends as much on unconscious perceptions as on established ideas. In science, the ability to refute is in direct proportion to the ability to state a position that is not only logical, but within our model of nature. Nature, we infer, does not change when the paradigm shifts. It's our perception of it, our story of it, that changes. A new theory will succeed only if it increases our command over nature. It was Newton's physics that got the first spaceship to the moon and back again. Within cultural polemics, positions are often indeed dialectically related within a continuum of the possible. But the relations that develop in real time do not necessarily follow the same logic. Rather, we see a continuous displacement of ruling ideas, never absolute, never complete, and usually confused. This corresponds to the analysis offered by Georg Simmel when he describes a constant succession of forms, each successive manifestation representing a liberation from the previous one, only to become in turn the source of a new containment. I'm quoting now from Simmel, Georg Simmel. Life can express itself and realize its freedom only through forms, yet forms must also necessarily suffocate life and obstruct freedom. Another one from Simmel. Life can manifest itself only in particular forms, yet owing to its essential restlessness, life constantly struggles against its own products, which have become fixed and do not move along with it. This process manifests itself as a displacement of an old form by a new form. This formulation has a great attraction in its very simplicity and seems to correspond with our experience. It may clarify the way in which we perceive history, not only at the level of changes in historiographical methods, but also in our fundamental sense of how times change, of how change becomes visible and declares itself, as in the case of Bergson's attribution to Sartre of an élan vital. We cannot count on that force to be part of our argument. Its existence may only be inferred after the event, and such concepts are not susceptible to proof. The historian cannot subject his facts to an empirical test. he must develop them by inference. The theory that goes with history is not of the kind that can make predictions and modify outcomes. It may, however, express and subsequently modify attitudes, and in this way play a part in inducing change. But with attitudes, we are dealing with another kind of framing of events, in that elusive zone situated between the creative individual and the group. The history of art, if we may place architecture within it, is situated squarely in that zone. Among the surprises in the history of modern architecture, surely none is so absolute as a mystery. In the sequence whereby traditional values based on a system of representational forms were overtaken by new forms engendered from a new principle of abstraction. Picasso demonstrates this better than anyone. For the visual arts in general, abstraction brought a release from the representational duty of forms, the mimetic function of art, and privileged the artist to enjoy a new freedom of composition based on his subjective perceptions. The personal nature of abstract style was not at first apparent. Abstraction seemed instead to confer a universal and objective status on the work of art. That's what Leslie Martin believed, but he was wrong in that. Architecture, too, was freed from the traditional duty of representation, not the mimesis of appearance, but recognition of socially accepted norms and conventions, the duty of being seen as appropriate. But abstraction, by its aura of universality, created within architecture a new duty, the duty towards the function of a building. Now, social responsibility took on a new and more absolute aspect. Architecture was freed at a stroke from the duty towards inherited vocabulary of representational forms, but passed immediately onto the thrall of function and became subservient to the exigencies of the program. The nature of this ambiguity is clarified by Colquhoun by adopting the idea of conflation. Abstract forms brought a new formalism along with a new freedom, and I'm quoting now from Colquhoun. I'm quoting from Colquhoun in his Essays in Architectural Criticism, the Opposition's book. Quote, "Art was not something transparent which described a reality outside of itself. It was a symbol of a reality which could be revealed only through its own substance. Modern architecture shared this artistic climate. Architecture was seen not as a neutral structure on whose surfaces were displayed representation of ideas, but as an opaque, reflective reality obeying its own internal laws. In architecture, however, this autonomous view was intimately bound up with its own technology. Thus, in a way quite different from the other arts, modern architecture conflated absolute formalism with the actual productive forces of society. There was in modern architecture an overlap between 19th century instrumentalism and modernist formalism, which does not occur in any of the other arts. Conflation of two ideas is, in logical terms, indecisive, indeterminate. Logic does not allow itself a thing to be itself and the opposite at the same time, and it has nothing to tell us about the way a thing can be at one time subject to opposing tendencies. However, in the world of empirical reality, as inferred from our scientific models of nature, there's no rule to prevent this overlap. The concept of conflation allows the expression of such a state of confusion, presumably close to the lived confusion in Zimmel's story of a struggle between different forms within society. It remains a task of the critic to adduce the particular circumstances that have attended such moments of mystery. They are always complex and very different from the simplified version that enters into the myth, and thus to clarify the dialectical process which lies below the surface of things. In this case, the explanation seems to lie in the self-image of the architect as a personage traditionally placed close to the sources of power. The architect is not able to function without a client who pays, traditionally the emperor, the church, the king, the state. Architects, as artists, were aware of the loss of authority they would suffer if their work came to be seen as free self-expression. Whereas the professional artists, such as Picasso and so on, were not to the same degree dependent on patronage, did not have to have a patron to pay for their material. So the architects were not as free as the other arts. I'm basically in agreement with Colquhoun here. I'm trying to elaborate his argument, or he would agree with me. In architecture, the lure of greater freedom lay in the direction of new technology, in identifying with the seemingly boundless horizons of science. It is the offspring of science, the glitter of new technology, that has dominated the imagination of architects who wish to be thought modern. Thank you.
As one might expect, we're of course running a little behind schedule, but there's time for one or two questions, and then we have to have a tea break. So if anyone has a particular question, or we can wait till the end, at the end of the day. I mean, I certainly had a question in Bob's last line, whether Alan would agree that technology is the sparkle or the inspiration, but maybe you want to wait on that. Do you want to repeat that last line, Bob? Because after saying you agreed with Alan, I felt like you were doing a monkey wrench.
Well, I don't know.
Maybe the mic?
I'm still arguing with him in a way.
You're arguing with him
I'm
when you
arguing with him in a way.
To speak to
I
the
agree
mic.
with him in principle, but I still like to argue with Alan, just like I enjoyed his article on the French railway stations. There's something about